In the Ed Puzzle this week, we're going to start the module by discussing the development of gender. And so you'll see in our reading this week and the plan on the schedules that we're covering two concepts that may not seem entirely related. One is the development of gender, and the other is academic performance. But it's important to learn these things one after the other, because we'll discuss the development of gender and then tie that to how gender norms and how we teach gender norms can then affect academic achievement in boys and girls differently. And so again, we're kind of looking at this interaction between nature and nurture and these two interrelated concepts. But first we need to tackle the development of gender. And so part of this lecture actually I took from our human sexuality classes that elaborate a little bit from what you read on the book. And so some of the content that's in this lecture is not necessarily covered in your reading. Some of it will be additional information, and I encourage you to take notes. I will be posting this lecture up on YouTube for you to review later on, but you can bet this is going to be some kind of short essay question on the last test. So let's get started. So this week we're looking at the development of gender. So what makes a boy and a girl a girl? Now let me preface this conversation by saying the amount of knowledge that we've gained through new science in the past 20 years about what we know about gender and what we know about biological sex, and perhaps how they can be influenced differently throughout development, resulting in them not necessarily being congruent or the same. What we know has changed a lot now from what we knew 20 years ago. And since these are such pivotal concepts for how we understand the world, each other, and ourselves, this new knowledge is not always welcome. And so this can be somewhat of an annoying conversation to some, as this new knowledge conflicts with what we've always thought before. And so if you're in that boat and you don't agree with what's being presented here, that's totally okay. Don't look at this as trying to change your mind, but perhaps just adding on to what you already know, with an intent of trying to keep an open mind. As in this lecture, I present science that's within the past 5 to 10 years, that's in addition to what you see in your book. As your book is an older edition, which I do that on purpose because it saves you money. It saves you about $200 for this older book. But the book's about 10 years old, and so we're missing a lot of stuff that's happened since then. And so that's what's presented here in this lecture. So by the end of this week, we will know what makes a boy and what makes a girl a girl. But to understand this and to understand gender, we have to understand the related concepts and how to differentiate them. So how gender is different from biological sex, or how gender is different from orientation. And so we don't cover sexual orientation in this reading or in this module, but I list it here just so we can differentiate and parse apart what these broader concepts are. So biological sex, of course, is essentially just the internal and external reproductive anatomy. It's determined by your sex chromosomes. And so that is located in the body. When a baby is born, you can physically see what sex it is because of its primary, which would be the gonads or the breasts or the penis or whatever, primary sex characteristics, and then secondary sex characteristics, which is all the stuff that happens at puberty, found in the body. Gender, on the other hand, is the psychological characteristics, which are both behavioral and social, that's associated with being a male or a female. So just like we can see someone's biological sex on their body by looking at it after birth, we can actually in brain scans see someone's gender. And so everyone's brain looks different, and we'll talk more about this in a second, but gender is 100% located in the brain, and it is due to physical organizational differences in the brain, but it is actually in there. It's not just a feeling. Now within gender, there's a bunch of subtopics that we also have to kind of differentiate that are introduced in the text briefly and can sometimes just be confusing if you don't understand which one we're talking about and perhaps what the differences are between them. And so gender and someone's gender identity are going to be the same thing. The gender is just someone's psychological characteristics, associating them with being a male or female, and their identity essentially is just their feeling of those psychological characteristics. So they psychologically feel like they're a male or psychologically feel like they're a female. That is the differentiation of their brain, how their brain is structured and organized will make them feel one way or another, or perhaps sometimes somewhere in the middle. Then the separate concepts that we have here that we'll conquer and discuss more in the next activity is gender norms. So these are culturally defined ways of behaving that are seen as appropriate for males and females. So boys acting like boys, girls acting like girls. So gender identity is feeling like a boy or feeling like a girl, and gender norms are how girls should act and how boys should act. And so this would include an attitude, like personality, acting like a boy, posture, the emotions that are appropriate for boys and girls to show, the job. So gender norms is going to affect a lot of things in the life. And so these are separate concepts, but of course related to each other. And then we have orientation, and so that's just going to be the gender that a person is attracted to, and that includes both emotionally, sexually, and romantically. And so we can actually see orientation in the brain as well. So we see sex is included here in the body, whereas these other two are found in the brain. And so brain development is going to be really important for understanding the development of gender. And then if you want to know more about the brain development of orientation, that's something we cover in more detail in the human sexuality course, which if you're about to register is offered session 1. So we need to understand how these things develop, so how biological sex develops, and then how gender develops, at what times they develop at, which are different actually, and then what can influence their development. So let's start with biological sex. Well, it's determined at birth based on primary characteristics in sex chromosomes. I'm actually gonna, here we go. So I changed this actually to say it's determined at conception because it is no longer determined at birth. We have a lot of tests that we can run now to determine the sex of your baby early on. Ultrasounds can detect gonads and physically see differences in gender around 20 weeks. And then we can even do blood tests that test for the chromosomes, the existence of the male chromosome in the blood, just by testing the mother's blood. So biological sex is determined at conception when the genes come together to form the embryo. And so the sex chromosomes are what really determine biological sex. You're either going to be XX or XY. XX being female, XY being male, of course. And then these chromosomes are essentially instructions, and they control the development of the internal and external sex hormones, the hormonal development that comes afterwards in the brain. So in the second month, the differentiation of the gonads begins. So the primary sex characteristics differentiate. So before 8 weeks, all embryos look exactly the same. They're all unisex. They all have these little itty bitty gonads that look the same in both people with male and female DNA. But at 8 weeks, something happens where the gene on the Y chromosome, so if it is a male and they have a Y chromosome, there's an SRI gene on it. And what it does is it signals and elicits the development of the gonads to the testes. And so if you have a Y chromosome, around 8 weeks, it sends signals and hormones out and says, okay, time to develop into a boy, and it will differentiate those gonads into testicles. If you don't have a Y chromosome because you're a female, then this signal will not occur, and then automatically the gonads will just stay where they are and become ovaries. And so we'll get used to this idea that the default here is always going to be female. Since both men and women have this X chromosome, only men have the Y, and so we all develop to be X except for men that have this Y that spurs these additional waves of development that change the body. So this is all month 8. Essentially, your biological sex, while it was determined at conception, develops and differentiates between males and females. So again, the female is the default. And then this SRI gene sends signals and hormones out that start to differentiate the body. Now we'll also see that these hormones will then later come out again and around month 5 to send signals out to differentiate the brain. And so one key thing to keep in mind is look at the difference between that month 2 and that month 5. They're 3 months apart. So the biological sex develops around month 2, and then it's not for another 3 months that the brain begins to sexually differentiate, which includes masculinization or feminization of certain structures of the brain. And so really starting in month 5 and going until around month 8, a lot of sexual differentiation of the brain occurs. And this is really the beginning and the mainstay of gender development. This is what makes someone psychologically a male or a female, want to behave that way or feel that way or identify that way. The brain is changing. So this is entirely hormone dependent. It has to be just the right mix of hormones for these different parts of the brain to differentiate and either become less feminine and more masculine or just stay feminine. So this is caused by androgens, which are male sex hormones, that are produced by the testicles that dropped down and came about around week 8, right? And so the androgens are what are signaling this differentiation. So the specific androgen release, certain amounts at certain levels at certain times, will develop and program the male reproductive behaviors that will come out later on. So already in months 5 through 8, hormones are programming the brain for what is going to happen at puberty, which is kind of crazy to think of. It's like coding a computer program that's not going to run until the end of the year when the calendar strikes a certain day. So everything's getting ready, but it's just not being activated yet. It also differentiates structures and how these structures are organized in the brain. And so this is going to correlate with future secondary characteristics, which essentially, again, is what happens at puberty, like the voice lowering or a breast developing, things of that nature. And then reproductive behaviors, so who you're attracted to. So we see that while we won't get into it here, that orientation is also going to be influenced during the sexual differentiation of the brain, just depending on the release of hormones and the hormonal environment that the embryo is in during these critical periods. And so all of these differentiation of structures and the programming of puberty and hormones, that's also known as the endocrine system, which is the hormonal system. And so it's being built now, and the way it's being built is entirely dependent on the hormones that are present during those critical periods. So what does that mean? We see just a pretty basic illustration here. So again, remember, female is the default, so we have a pretty straight, narrow path here. We just start as the default, the gonads stay ovaries, and then as a result, everything develops to be feminine. You end up with feminine biological sex and usually feminine gender. On the other hand, you see this extra step here and an extra step here that have to come for males. And so the gonads instead turn into testicles. They start producing androgens, which are both the testosterone and the estriol. And then those signal not only the masculinization of the brain and the development of a masculine endocrine system, but also the defeminization of the brain. Okay, so there's a lot of things that are happening here. There's a lot of things that have to happen just right. So since this biological sex programs the multiple waves, biological sex being the chromosomes, right? And so the chromosomes and whatever gonads resulted from them are sending out hormones. and they are programming the multiple waves of sexual prenatal differentiation of the brain that are responsible for masculinizing the brain and making someone psychologically male or having a male gender, or being left female. But any of these waves can be influenced by the environment, by the hormones that are present, the amount of hormones that are being excreted, by stress that's being induced, by chemicals and nutrients and other things of that nature, meaning more or less differentiation might occur. And since there's lots of waves and there's lots of different things that are differentiating, a week of that development might be affected so that one little part of this differentiation is less masculine or more masculine or something. And so this is why all of us have, I'm going to go to this. This is why all of us have, we are seen on a spectrum of gender, right? And so everyone's brain at the end of this ends up looking a little different. It's not that we have a male brain and a female brain, but typically we will see more masculinized brains and more femininized brains, okay? So just depending on the hormones that are around during each little part of this brain differentiation, we can see typically female brains here, of course we're using pink and blue, are going to remain more feminized, and that is indicated here by having the majority of the pink, and of course more male brains having more of the blue here. But for every single person, it's going to be slightly different. And you might have some people that are a total mix of pink and blue altogether. And so the way we're put together is 1000% different. So while I said you could see gender in the brain, we can see one is more masculine or one is more feminine. None of them are going to look identical, and they're all going to be different and seen on a spectrum from more or less masculine, not being one or the other necessarily. So here's another visual to consider here. So essentially, prenatally, males have more sensitive periods than girls do, okay? Females are the default. Again, nothing has to change in the womb, and the fetus will just automatically develop to be female. But the male, we have to have this special recipe and these hormones being emitted by the gonads, and then the prenatal hormone environment staying stable throughout all these different critical periods for this male differentiation of the brain to occur successfully. And so there's just more room for error here with male fetuses. And so these critical periods, again, are affected by hormones, medications, nutrients, and other chemicals. They're really affected by stress. Stress in the mother can cause masculinization of places in the brain. And so that might sound scary, that something might masculinize if you're stressed out when you're pregnant, but don't be afraid. Just because something masculinizes a bit in the brain doesn't mean that you're going to have a baby with incongruent gender or something. But this is simply where we get different kind of behavioral personalities and things of that nature. Very small, perhaps one extra little blue part in this scheme of mostly pink or something like that. So don't think of it as, I'm stressed out, my girl's going to come out a boy, but rather that moods, hormones, and other things can affect all these individual little blocks. And so if you have a lot of that accumulating over time, you might begin to get something that's a little bit more weighted towards a gender that's incongruent with sex. But really all of us are going to experience stress to some level while pregnant. And in some cases, the mothers or the fetus itself might be insensitive to androgens, so they can be immune to the male hormones. And there's a theory that says that the more sons you have, the mother's body will develop an immunity to these male hormones, almost like like an immune response to any virus or any other thing that you're exposed to multiple times. And so if you become insensitive to them, and they're not going to affect the development as much. If they're put out at the wrong time or in the wrong amount, then sometimes the embryo will not masculinize and it can remain a little bit more feminized in the brain. Whereas on the other hand, If androgens are exposed to a biologically female fetus during these times of critical periods, then it can again begin to masculinize, and also, again, as I mentioned, stress can cause this as well. So it's not all or nothing. Some parts of differentiation may be more or less masculinized than others. So we end up being these really individual mosaics of things that are dependent upon the genes, the personality you were born with, and then other things like the prenatal environment, the hormones you're around, and things of that nature. So since the sexual differentiation of the genitals takes place in the first 2 months of pregnancy, but the sexual differentiation of the brain starts in the second half, starting in month 5, these two processes can be influenced independently. And so that's how we could get someone potentially with an incongruent biological sex and gender or gender identity. So we see, just as a review, this stuff happening in month 2. And then throughout the second half of development, we have the sexual differentiation of the brain. So sexual, biological sex develops here. Gender and orientation develop here. There's also a lot of new research that points towards epigenetic changes that can be responsible for more masculinization or feminization in the brain as well. And so there's a lot of interesting work on that. It's a little bit too complex to introduce in this class, but the idea is that a dichotomous view of gender, of being born a boy or born a female and having that line up with the biological sex, it's way too complicated to be understood like that. And so we're understanding the ways that nature and nurture can interact to make these things congruent or incongruent. And so again, we covered here biological sex, that's the chromosomes and the resulting primary and secondary sexual characteristics. We covered gender. Again, that's the sex of the brain, how the brain differentiates, which results in the psychological characteristics associated with being a male or female. And that in turn results in your identity. And so gender and gender identity are going to be the same, but not necessarily the same as biological sex. And then we have gender norms, which is where we're going to go in this next activity. So again, gender norms are the culturally defined ways of behaving that are seen as appropriate for males and females. They're also called stereotypes or roles. And so we say they're culturally defined because what's normal for a man or a woman is completely different across different cultures. Okay, so they're really just ways of knowing that develop within your particular community. Even within the United States, there's different ways that men and women should act within different subcultures. And so this is the next part we're going to conquer, and this is socially learned, whereas these are determined biologically either through development of the sexual characteristics or development of the brain. This is the only part that is socially learned after birth. And so in this one, we've covered gender identity. So feeling like a girl will lead to you, feeling like a boy or girl will lead to you identifying as a boy or girl, and then that in turn will lead to the drive to act like a boy or girl. So these are all gender identity and the psychological gender. And this next thing we're going to talk about is gender norms. And so you have this drive to act like a boy or girl, and then what you learn and are taught is the knowledge about how a boy or girl acts. And these gender norms are so deeply embedded in our culture that for a long time we assumed that they were natural and inherent. But we can parse these two apart now, that these gender norms are socially learned, and they're slowly changing over time. And so in the next discussion, we're going to focus on how gender norms are taught and how the consequences of those norms can later appear in academic abilities, in career choices, in attitudes, and things of that nature.